Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another review. Today I'm reviewing a film that I had taped on the DVR and I got around to watching it earlier in this week. It's a film I've been aware of for several years. I've seen bits and pieces of it now and again flipping through channels, but I've never been able to sit down and watch it all the way through. Well, I saw it was on Turner Classic Movies and I'm like, record? Yeah, I finally got around to watching it last Monday. And it is the 1954 sci-fi monster film Them, the movie about giant radioactive ants. If you were to go through the history of sci-fi cinema and assign a couple films to each decade to basically summarize how the films in a specific genre were during that decade, Them would definitely be one of the films you would assign to the 50s. It's definitely a film of this decade, especially with the whole worldwide fear and buildup of nuclear weapons. It's really personified in the radioactive ants. Though personally, I think the movie Godzilla does a little bit of a better job on this, but Them does do a good job honing that in. But the only thing about it touches on when it comes to nuclear weapons is the fact that the radioactive tests, at least from the first atomic bomb, is what it created the ants. It doesn't really touch on it any more than that, other than them trying to destroy the ants. In the end, it does touch on it a little bit about, what if this was from the first atomic bomb test and what could happen from the later ones. The film was directed by Gordon Douglas, who is known for In Like Flint and Robin and the Seven Hoods, among other films. Those are just the two that stood out. And as a director, I thought he did a good job. He got some good performances out of the actors, mainly the lead ones. The first 28 minutes of the film where we see no giant ants whatsoever, and then if you were to just flip through the channels and not read the synopsis, you wouldn't even think this is a monster movie because of how the first 28 minutes is paced. It feels like it's just like a normal thriller. I mean, there's a couple of little minor things that kind of hint that it's not really a normal thriller. I mean, the size of the hole in the wall and the fact that sugar is stolen, but it's just the way the film is paced and the way that he uses the camera. It really adds a sense of tension to the film. Now, a little of this is kind of thrown out once you see it's just a monster movie, but it's only a little bit thrown out. Even with how the special effects for the ants look, the way that Gordon shoots the film, it makes them look as best as they can. Because, this is the 50s. You're not going to have large animatronics that are going to look as good as, say, the dinosaurs in the first Jurassic Park film. The technology hadn't gotten there yet. Of course, they could have always gone the King Kong route and use stop motion and then try to integrate it, but I don't know if they had the time or the budget to do something like that. Now, given that this is a monster movie, obviously the cast is going to be large. I mean, there's going to be a lot of extras and a lot of minor characters. And when it comes to the actors, I'm only going to be focusing on the main characters. We have James Whitmore playing Sergeant Ben Peterson. He's mostly known for playing the president of the Assembly in Planet of the Apes, and he also played Brooks in The Shawshank Redemption, and that's the one I personally remember him from. Whole time watching the film, I'm looking at him, go, this guy looks familiar. Google, oh, it's him. He does a great job for the police sergeant, especially as the film goes on. Goes from being like a normal cop to going into military mode, and of course, the end of his character is kind of fitting, but a little bit sad. I'm not going to mention it though. Then we got Edmund Gwenn playing Dr. Medford. He's mostly known for playing Kris Kringle in the original Miracle on 34th Street, a film role that he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for. And as Medford, he does a pretty good job. I mean, he's the one that's mostly spatting all the technical mumbo jumbo when it comes to ants and all that. I haven't really seen the original Miracle on 34th Street, so I cannot really say from personal experience how this role compares to that one, but just going off of this, he was a pretty good actor. And this was one of his last film roles because he was in his 80s when he did this one. Just looking at him, he doesn't look like he's in his 80s, at least in this film. He looks like I'd say he's more like in his late 60s, early 70s, but that's makeup for you. We got James Arness playing FBI agent Robert Graham. He's famously known for playing Marshal Matt Dillon on Gunsmoke, and he does a pretty good job as the FBI agent. Then we got Joan Weldon as Dr. Medford's daughter, Pat Medford. She's mostly known for being in episodes of Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel, an episode of Perry Mason, among other things. And for what she has to do in this film, she does a pretty good job. And this is something I didn't notice. Apparently, Leonard Nimoy had a small uncredited role as a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant in the communication room in this film, which I didn't even notice that. I guess it's, such a small role you can't really notice it, and I guess he didn't really have any dialogue. It's not like Clint Eastwood in some of the early films that he was in, where if you go back and watch it, like, hey, it's Clint Eastwood. Maybe it's one of those ones in this film. It's probably one of those things where if you blink and you miss it. Now, I looked through the trivia and there was only a couple little minor interesting notes. For instance, this was Warner Brothers' highest grossing film of 1954. Now, I don't have their list of films right in front of me, but I can kind of see why it would be their highest grossing one. I mean, 50s, monster movies, of like especially ones like this, were all the rage, so I can understand why it grossed higher than a lot of the other films. Another interesting thing is that the film was originally supposed to be in 3D, and even in the final film, you can tell in certain areas, such as how the ants have extreme close ups, and then at one point a flamethrower shoots straight into the camera. I don't know if those were filmed early or if those were just used, to test to see how the effects would come out, and then at the last minute they decided not to film it in 3D or to release it in 3D. Maybe if it's the latter where they, at the last minute decided to cut the 3D effects and those things couldn't be reshot. But, outside of looking up that information, I wouldn't have noticed. It just looked like, someone using that as its intended shot. And this is another thing, is that the film was originally supposed to be filmed in color, but 2 days before shooting began, the studio, who was nervous, decided to cut the budget, and the film had to be made in black and white instead. I think that worked out for the better, because with how some of the effects in the film are, I don't think they would have looked as good in color. Would have been one of those weird things where it might have actually looked, for lack of a better term, faker. I mean, it's just like if you were to colorize King Kong, it might not look as good. Granted, they have colorized King Kong, but I've never watched the colorized versions, mainly as a protest against Ted Turner, because I think he was the one that had it colorized. Now, this film, like I said, lack of a better term, would have looked faker, and might have actually hurt the film. This is one of those cases where I think black and white helps the film, just like Psycho. That was also done in black and white for budget reasons, partially, but also for film reasons, because in color it might not have come out as well. Granted, we already kind of have a thing with the Psycho remake to show how it would have been in color, but that's a slightly different scenario. In conclusion, this is a pretty good monster film. Like I said earlier, the first 28 minutes with no ants are paced very well, and it still is paced pretty good after that. It goes from being something that feels like it's just like an ordinary murder mystery to being a monster film, and the transition does happen pretty naturally. The effects, while good for their time, definitely never aged that well. It's hard to say how they looked back then, because, obviously I wasn't born yet. And, the only way to actually know would be to ask someone, but then that might also be that viewpoint might be slightly skewed due to the passage of time. You'd have to probably look up reviews from the time period to actually find out what people thought of the effects back then. But it's definitely effects of the time. But other than that, the movie still is a very entertaining monster film to watch. And like I said earlier, it definitely is one that you would hold up and this is what the 50s sci-fi films were like, along with of course other films. But this is definitely one of the ones that you put up there.